After spending $180 million to study the CRC, John Kitzhaber wants to spend another $2.7 billion to build it and force light rail on Vancouver. We at Oregon Capitol Watch call that a boondoggle. Why? Because it's a financial disaster whose numbers don't add up, complete with bigger traffic jams and massive cost overruns, likely costing you more money. So why are we laying the CRC boondoggle at Governor John Kitzhaber's feet? Well, he's advocating that Oregon go it alone and build this monstrosity now that Washington State has said no. In fact, at his urging, the Oregon legislature has appointed a special committee to hold hearings, creating the illusion that they're really gonna listen to you this time. All the while, the backroom deals will have been made, the votes will have been bought, and the outcome predetermined. I know, as a former legislator, I can tell you this is how it gets done. You see, a small army of consultants, contractors, and lobbyists have made a lot of money from the $180 million tax dollars spent so far just for studies, all at your expense. Do you really think they're just going to walk away from billions more? Not with that kind of money at stake, and you can bet they'll do whatever it takes to convince lawmakers to go it alone. Like releasing inaccurate traffic and tolling forecasts to convince legislators that the CRC will actually pay for itself. And how accurate are these tolling forecasts by CDM Smith? Well, not very good if history's any guide. This 2006 Denver Post story details 13 CDM Smith toll roads, only one of which met its projections in the first year, and with only 2 meeting their projections by the 3rd year. One of them, a $200 million project in South Carolina, was 64% off its original projections. So bad, the toll road defaulted on the bonds and declared bankruptcy. Oh, and CDM Smith? They walked away with $12 million promised to them if the $200 million in bonds were sold. With that kind of incentive, it's no wonder CDM Smith's projections were questioned for their objectivity, and they were accused of having a conflict of interest. Now, these error-filled, over-optimistic projections seem to be the norm in the industry, as pointed out by this 2009 Bain study titled Error and Optimism in Toll Road Forecasts, and the 2012 Reston Citizens Association study, whose subtitle says it all, Plenty of Room for Error. Oh, and what about the Tacoma Narrows Bridge being so far off its traffic projections and struggling to remain financially solvent? You guessed it, CDM Smith has that contract also. Does all of this make you feel a little nervous? Respected economist Joe Cortright from Impressa recently released a bombshell analysis of the CRC's new traffic forecast, showing nearly 50,000 cars a day will divert to I-205 to avoid paying I-5 tolls, creating gridlock and reducing tolling revenue. Yet the Oregon legislature decided to fund the CRC based on earlier forecasts contained in the final environmental impact statement that were dramatically different and much more optimistic. So much so that Cortright concludes the new forecast contradicts and invalidates traffic projections used in the CRC planning and environmental impact reports over the past 7 years. It casts serious doubt on the project's environmental impact statement, the need for the project, supposed transit benefits, and the risk of extreme traffic diversion. And it goes on and on and on, detailing how the legislature never saw the data that details how far off the traffic and tolling projections are from reality. By the way, this information wasn't offered to the legislature by the CRC and was only obtained through a public records request by Cortright. It's not very transparent, is it? It's no wonder that we and others are a bit skeptical that the CRC will actually generate enough tolls to pay for itself. Oh, and one other thing. If the CRC doesn't generate enough tolls on the I-5 bridge, don't you think they'd be tempted to toll the I-205 bridge also? Just saying. By the way, it's a diverse group who doesn't buy the story coming from the CRC. Blue Oregon's Evan Manville has called it a boondoggle, and Willamette Week's Nigel Jaquist has written several articles, one in particular entitled A Bridge Too False, calling into question the honesty of CRC claims about why the project is needed. Even Oregonian columnist Steve Dean called the CRC an ongoing, unnerving train wreck, pointing out they've spent $175 million without moving a shovel of dirt. And its traffic and tolling projections have been misleading, if not deceitful. And he points out that little problem about Oregon not having legal authority to establish tolls, surcharges, and late fees, all from Washington commuters. And with Oregon's history of badly underestimating several big road projects that we, the taxpayers, were told were on budget and on time, Yogi Berra's famous quote rings true. It's deja vu all over again. Projects like Highway 20 that ballooned from $140 million to nearly $400 million. It isn't hard to see why we think the CRC will cost much more than what they're telling us. Perhaps a lot more. Joe Cortright conducted an earlier study for Plaid Pantries that showed the cost could be as high as $10 billion or more, 2.5 times more than the original estimate. It says this project doesn't add up to a happy ending, an understatement if there ever was one. It also says it will create a multi-generational financial disaster, and that the current proposal is a debt bomb that taxpayers will pay for. Not a very pretty picture, is it? Yet Governor Kitzhaber still wants to move forward with the CRC boondoggle, choosing to ignore not only these credible warnings, but others as well. Like the series of reports from forensic accountant Tiffany Couch, detailing accounting irregularities, discrepancies in CRC documents, pork barrel spending for unrelated projects, and so forth, that are all on her website, acuityforensics.com. A recent news article described how her and her team examined thousands of pages of electronic documents provided by the CRC, finding that they were unable to account for how the CRC spent $108 million in public funds over 6 years, plus many other irregularities. So Oregon Capitol Watch decided to interview her on camera about her investigation into CRC finances. So Tiffany, in your professional opinion as a forensic accountant, has the CRC project been truthful and transparent?
No, unfortunately not. And not in just one or two cases, in multiple cases. And I'm not the only expert that's sort of uncovered these discrepancies. You know, we've got Joe Cortright, John Charles, there are other experts out there that have are coming up with the same conclusions and the same sorts of information to legislators in terms of these discrepancies.
So the CRC dumped 30,000 lines of electronic information on you and your team. What did you find when you got through that?
When I looked at the data, I found a couple of really interesting things. First, 70% of that money, it was like $88 million at the time, had gone to one vendor, and that vendor was David Evans and Associates. So 88% of $125 million had gone to a single vendor. That was a significant, finding. We obviously needed to look at what was going on with that contract. The second most significant thing I found was at the time, $17 or $18 million worth of unknown expenditures. And I say unknown because where you would have a payee listed, it just said not required. And it was over and over and over again, transaction after transaction, we had a not required payee. And that summed up to well over $18 million at that time. We discovered that they were paying approximately $30,000 a month in rent for the office space they had here in town. So those were sort of the top three things that we found with that data. And it was significant enough that Mr. Madore said, well, Tiffany, why don't you look into that David Evans and Associates contract and find out, why they got that much money and what's going on. And that's really sort of what started the public records requests and us asking more questions.
Tiffany, in your first report, you indicate that you used only CRC documentation. What did you find?
Oh, that's a good point, and I appreciate you bringing up. So I have not made any projections. I have not come to any conclusion that is not supported by a CRC-related document that I received directly from the CRC office. So everything that I've put forward is exactly from the Columbia River Crossing Project office. It's not anything that I've created or made up myself. This was the only non-financial report that we issued, and I struggled with that. But I had to kind of look at the initials next to my name, and the first three initials after my last name are CPA, Certified Public Accountant. And the information that I was finding in these documents was too important not to tell the legislators, that I, put the information together so the legislators could understand what was going on.
Your investigation seems to have uncovered an internal memo that indicates the CRC was, well, maybe less than truthful with the legislature.
In the process of asking for those documents, we received a draft internal memo that was dated in 2005. And it basically is a memo between the staffers in the Columbia River Crossing office. And it was problematic, to say the least. It basically said, here's how we're going to manage the Project Sponsors Council. We are not going to, and they had a whole list of things that they were going to do, but some of the concerns we had was verbiage that we're going to, quote unquote, work the public officials prior to the meetings. We're going to make sure there is very little deliberation during the public meetings so that a decision can be made quickly. We are not going to encourage public participation. We are going to only post the minimum notices for these meetings. This was all in an internal memo as to how the CRC project office staff was going to manage both the public and the public officials in getting this project launched and off the ground.
Your second report details how David Evans and Associates contract went from $50 million to $131 million. How did that happen?
In March or May of 2005, David Evans was given a $50 million contract, and that contract was to get the CRC office or project off the ground and all the way through the record of decision for $50 million, okay? Maximum amount payable. That's what the front of the contract says. So we were trying to figure out, well, we've got a contract of $50 million. We know at this period of time, at least $88 million has been spent. How did this happen? And we discovered several amendments to the contract that did not change the scope of work. It just increased the amount of money being paid. And the first one said this contract is $50 million. We're asking for $45 more million, up to $95 million. We're not changing the scope of services. We're only asking for additional money. And that was a 2-page amendment, and it was signed off by a few people, and $45 million was provided to this contract. Did
David Evans' own design errors lead to the need to increase their contract?
We would have change orders that were the exact same verbiage, asking for more money for the same change order, and maybe the change order was dated a year ago, and now this change order is new, dated now, and it's for the same exact change. It's the same exact type of work. We were seeing duplicate change orders, duplicate task orders. So we were very concerned that the state of Washington and the state of Oregon was paying for work that had already been done. We knew that errors had been made because that's in the newspaper, right? I mean, the expert review panel said, you've designed a bridge that can't be built. And then we would see task orders and change orders saying we need to do a redesign, or, we need to work on this bridge clearance issue, the 95-foot issue. And so then they would basically get more money to mitigate some of the problems that were being seen in the design. And when you go to the Washington State manual, it basically says, you can claw back money from a contractor if they've made errors.
But that hasn't
And
happened
I
yet.
was questioning why the legislators had not done that, and you're right, that has not happened yet.
Were there public contracting laws or rules that appear to have been broken in this process?
Report number 2, the contracts and task order report, really harkens all the way back to the original spreadsheet we got, right? With all of the money being spent on David Evans and Associates. So a lot of our public records requests were, can we have the contract? Can we look at all the amendments to the contract? Can we look at the task orders that tell the state what work is going to be done? Can we look at every invoice they billed to the state of Washington? So we went through this entire contract and all of the billings, etc. David Evans, number one, had done a lot of studies on the I-5 corridor between 1995 and 2005. So we first questioned the conflict of interest, because there is, in the services manual, the contractor services manual for the state of Washington, it clearly says if a contractor has already done work or potentially has a conflict of interest, there's all of these other things that you need to do before you can give them another contract. And we asked for that. That information was never provided. It does not look like that conflict of interest documentation was done.
Tiffany, in report number 3, it seems you've uncovered Ruby Junction and the Steel Bridge expenditures, which really aren't a part of this project, are they?
That's a good question. And I happened upon these costs on accident. I was doing a search for the CRC on Google, and the FTA, the Federal Transportation Administration documents came up. And it was basically the CRC project office's application for the New Starts grant. And there was a blurb there. It said project description, and it talks about a 5-mile bridge, and it talks about a light rail project, and then it says we're going to do upgrades to a maintenance facility in Gresham called Ruby Junction, and we're going to do upgrades to the steel bridge in this project description for the money we're asking for from the feds. And I said, I was very familiar at the time with the map, and the map always shows the 5-mile, bridge project area. I had never heard of this. I'd never seen anything related to these. So I started asking the CRC for documents related to this, and they really stalled me. They wouldn't give me the information, and long story short, they finally did. Ruby Junction. It's the maintenance facility that does the light rail maintenance every night for all of TriMet's projects. They were asking for $50 million to upgrade the facility. So I started looking into that, and it was multiple times more than the current upgrade to the facility on the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail project. It was multiple times more than the upgrade when they got the yellow line about 10 years ago. In fact, I looked at a project in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, and an upgrade to a facility there where they were buying new land and building a brand new facility, and I think that was like 20 or 25 million. So we were asking for $50 million for an upgrade to a facility that already exists in Gresham, and I did not understand, number one, why they weren't telling legislators about this project specifically and why it was so much. So I questioned that. And then the steel bridge was something very similar. Why are we upgrading the steel bridge? It's not part of the map. It's not part of the bridge influence area. And why aren't we telling legislators about that? And I think it's important to note in that report, I tell the readers, here's the actual testimony by the CRC officials in a public meeting and how they were not being forthcoming to the legislators about this very issue.
So Tiffany, in report number 4, you uncover some details of the CRC's own financing plan that appear to be inconsistent and maybe the public isn't aware of?
Their own documents said yes, $450 million from the states and $900 million from the feds. Important part about the federal money. Number one, they would have to ask for it every single year for 8.5 years, and they would have to bank on getting the maximum amount available from the feds, $100 million per year. That's number one. Number two, They had banked on $450 million from a federal program that was non-existent. And I felt like the legislators needed to know that they had a funding shortage of $450 million. And number three, that they were planning that this project was going to cost $5.5 billion. And let me be very clear, $3.5 billion was going to be what it cost to build it, and then $2 billion was going to be what it cost to pay the interest on the bonds, to operate and maintain the bridge, and to collect the toll.
From these same official documents, what are the range of tolls that will be necessary to pay for this project?
They put a toll rate schedule in their final environmental impact statement, and they said it was about $2.50 during peak commute hours. But that was $2.50 in the year 2005 dollars. But they issued this report in 2010 or 2011. So I said, okay, using their inflationary assumptions of 2 or 2.5% a year, we were looking at a $4 one-way toll in the year 2018 or 2019 when the toll started. So we were looking at minimally $8 round trip, which equates to $1 an hour pay cut if you're driving into, to Portland, or Portlanders coming to Vancouver. But what was interesting was in the finance plan, it says for any cost overruns or any other, discrepancies in our funding plan, we feel like we can go upwards of $16 one way for tolls. They felt like they could do that without getting mass diversion to I-205. There is a little blurb in the finance plan that they felt like they could go upwards of $16.
So please explain what you found about the total cost of this project and over what length of time.
They quietly increased the tolling time to be not 30 years, but 45 years. And their new projection is they're going to collect between $6 billion and $10 billion worth of tolls in those 45 years, without explaining as to why. What funding source did they feel like was going away, that they needed to collect that many tolls? Did they feel like the project was going to be higher than what they were projecting? I don't know, but all I can tell you is the most recent tolling projections issued in March 2013 say 45 years, and oh, by the way, under these various scenarios, the low end is $6 billion, the high end is $10 billion in toll collection.
So if the tolling forecasts for the I-5 bridge don't come true, what are the chances that they would consider tolling the I-205 bridge also?
It is my understanding that Oregon has the authority to do so. There are a lot of experts out there. There's a lot of common sense out there, right? Am I going to choose, not to pay the toll and go to 205? How much traffic diversion is there really going to be? And Joe Cortright has done a great job of analyzing that newly issued March 2013 report and saying, hey, listen, they know there's going to be a large diversion there, and would somebody that's going to back those bonds or underwrite those bonds allow for you to not toll I-205? I think that's a big question out there.
In report number 5, you uncover some pretty shady contractor practices and definitions, including Patricia McCaig, who was campaign manager for Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber. Why don't you describe exactly what it is that you found?
It's very important to understand what an independent contractor is. As a certified public accountant, as somebody that owns her own business, clients hire me, I go to the client, I say, here's what I think you should do, here's when I can come